I can still see the room as clearly as if it's frozen in time. A crowded HOA meeting hall filled with uncomfortable folding chairs, restless neighbors, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. And I remember the exact second I stood up, straightened my back, and calmly announced that I personally controlled 51% of the total voting power inside Whispering Pines Community Association. Because in that instant, Margaret Hensley's expression collapsed so fast, it was almost physical, her confident posture giving way to disbelief, her fingers tightening around the binder she had used for years like a weapon. And as the room fell silent, I could feel every eye turn toward me, all of them silently asking the same question. How did it come to this? So let me take you back, all the way back to when everything still felt possible. My name is Alex Morgan, and I grew up in a family where stability was something you chased, not something you were handed, the kind of household where money was counted carefully and dreams were postponed responsibly. And when I became a software engineer, it felt like I finally cracked the code, literally and figuratively, long nights in front of glowing monitors, skipped holidays, missed weddings, all traded for a chance at something simple, a house of my own. When I first drove through Whispering Pines, I remember thinking it looked like the promise we're all sold as kids. Tree-lined streets, clean sidewalks, quiet evenings, and an HOA that marketed itself as organized, transparent, and fair, charging a monthly fee of $150, an amount that felt reasonable for manicured common areas and a sense of order. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe that I'd arrived. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Friendly newsletters, welcoming emails, polite reminders about trash pickup and community events, and I settled into my routines. Morning runs, weekend grocery trips, quiet nights where the biggest decision I made was what to cook for dinner. Until one afternoon I opened my mailbox and found the letter that changed everything. It was a violation notice, formal language, bold headings, warning me that the color of my mailbox didn't comply with community standards. And I remember laughing out loud at first, because I had written approval from the architectural committee, approval I made sure to get before I spent a dollar, because that's how I operate, careful, methodical, by the book. I brought the paperwork to Margaret Hensley, the HOA president, expecting a quick correction, an apology maybe, and instead I was met with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile people wear when they know something you don't, and she told me, calmly, confidently, that because I was technically not in good standing due to the violation, I wasn't allowed to access the HOA records that would prove I was right. It was a perfect catch. 22, circular, airtight, designed not to resolve anything, but to remind me who was in charge. When I pushed back, still polite, still believing this was a misunderstanding, she leaned slightly closer and said, almost casually, "If you don't like how things work here, you can always sell your house." That was the moment the dream cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that I could feel it under my feet. I started noticing things after that, patterns I hadn't seen before, how the same names always appeared on the board, how dissenters seemed to vanish, how rules were enforced selectively, and a quiet realization settled in. The HOA wasn't just managing the neighborhood, it was controlling it. By the end of my first year, I knew one thing for certain. This had never been about a mailbox. Truth rarely announces itself. It leaks, it arrives through whispers and side conversations. And mine began with Eleanor Price, my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher with sharp instincts and decades of quiet observation behind her, who invited me over for coffee one afternoon and spoke in the careful tone of someone who had learned when to lower her voice. She told me how Whispering Pines used to feel like a community, how fees had slowly increased while amenities quietly disappeared, how anyone who questioned Margaret suddenly found themselves drowning in violations and legal threats, and how one homeowner who tried to dig into the finances ended up sued into submission and forced to sell just to escape. Then came the rumors, second reserve account no one could explain, budgets that never quite balanced, whispers about intimidation disguised as governance. And before I could fully process that, the certified letter arrived at my door. $350,000. That was the amount Whispering Pines Community Association claimed I owed for unpaid obligations from a previous owner. A debt that legally could not exist because I had an estoppel letter, clean title insurance, and written confirmation that the property was clear at purchase. And yet the letter threatened a lien, foreclosure, and public posting of my address if I didn't comply. That's when the harassment became systematic. Minor violations appeared almost daily. Trash cans placed inches off target, grass measured with near-scientific precision, notices designed not to fix anything, but to exhaust me emotionally and financially, and every attempt to ask questions only resulted in more pressure, not answers. I realized I wasn't alone when I created a private Facebook group, expecting maybe a handful of frustrated neighbors, and within days, dozens joined, all telling eerily similar stories, different details, same tactics. That's how I met Robert Keller, a former board member who left under suspicious circumstances, and when we finally spoke in person, he confirmed what we'd started to suspect. Margaret Hensley and her partner Richard Lowell controlled multiple HOA contracts through a shell company, awarding work to themselves, inflating costs, and using a program they called Project Renewal to fabricate debts, pressure newer homeowners, and quietly funnel properties to connected real estate investors. When I raised concerns publicly, the response wasn't clarification, it was escalation. Foreclosure notices were posted publicly, right outside my home. Humiliation as a weapon, fear as leverage, the clear message being that compliance was cheaper than resistance. Instead of folding, I dug deeper. The real turning point didn't come from yelling or lawsuits or standing toe-to-toe with power. It came late at night, alone, exhausted, sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of HOA bylaws that smelled like dust and neglect, the kind of document no one ever reads because it's designed to bore you into submission, and yet somewhere between sections no one had cited in years, buried so deep it felt almost accidental. I saw it, a single clause so dry, so technical, so painfully uninteresting, that it had survived untouched for decades. Voting power within the HOA was allocated per lot, not per homeowner, and the moment those words truly registered, the room seemed to tilt slightly, my heart rate spiked, and my hands began to shake in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. I cross-referenced the clause with county property records, slowly at first, cautiously, afraid to trust what I was seeing, and that's when the second realization hit. 12 abandoned lots inside Whispering Pines, not owned by families, not maintained, not spoken about, tied up in bankruptcy proceedings, unloved, unwanted, quietly bleeding value, while everyone pretended they didn't exist. 12 invisible votes, just sitting there, waiting for someone who knew where to look. I did the math over and over, not because it was complicated, but because I needed to believe it. If I bought all 12 lots, I wouldn't just have influence, I wouldn't just have a voice, I would have control, 51% of the voting power, enough to stop everything, enough to tear the system open from the inside, and the realization didn't feel triumphant, it felt terrifying. The plan was reckless, irrational, financially suicidal, and at the same time, the only move left on the board. There was no backup plan, no safety net, no version of this where I lost politely and walked away intact. So I drained my savings, every account I'd built slowly over years of discipline. I borrowed against everything I owned. I signed documents with a pen that felt heavier each time it touched paper, knowing that if this failed, I wouldn't just lose a house, I would lose my future. And within weeks, the impossible became real. 12 deeds in my name, stacked neatly inside a folder that looked far too ordinary for the weight it carried. 51% of the HOA's voting power sitting silently on my kitchen table, while Margaret continued to operate under the comforting illusion that she was untouchable. The night before the meeting didn't feel like a night at all. It felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible, legal documents spread across the table, highlighted, tabbed, triple-checked, my phone buzzing with messages from neighbors who didn't yet know what was coming. And I remember staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, thinking about how absurd it was that everything I'd worked for now hinged on a clause no one else bothered to read. The meeting itself was unlike anything I'd ever seen in Whispering Pines. The room packed wall to wall with residents, tension thick enough to taste, people whispering, shifting in their seats, because everyone could feel something was different even if they didn't know what. And Margaret Hensley opened the meeting exactly the way she always did, confident, controlled, attempting to push through stricter foreclosure rules, tightening her grip one last time, speaking about efficiency and Compliance, like those words hadn't ruined lives. That's when I stood up. Not dramatically, not angrily, just slowly, deliberately, feeling every eye turn toward me. And I asked for a voting roll verification, watching confusion ripple across the board, then disbelief, then something much closer to panic, and when I calmly disclosed ownership of the 12 abandoned lots, the room seemed to inhale all at once. Procedural tricks were attempted and failed. Objections were raised and collapsed under their own weight. Voices that had bullied others into silence suddenly sounded small. And when Robert Keller stood up and publicly confirmed the records, the last thread holding the old narrative together snapped. The vote happened faster than anyone expected. The board was removed. Evidence was formally submitted. An independent audit was ordered. And when the numbers came back, they weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. Nearly $2 million missing, siphoned through shell companies, hidden behind inflated contracts and fake projects. Proof so clear it erased years of intimidation in a single stroke. Criminal charges followed swiftly, not as revenge, but as consequence. Margaret Hensley, Richard Lowell, and Benjamin Cross were prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced, the same system they had weaponized finally turning its full weight against them. In the weeks that followed, something quietly extraordinary happened. Fees dropped. Amenities returned. Fear loosened its grip. A community garden replaced warning notices. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for years started talking again. And I realized I hadn't just kept my house. I had reclaimed something much bigger: purpose, trust, the belief that power doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest or threaten the most, but to those who are willing to read, to understand, and to stand up when silence becomes complicity. Because the American dream was never about obedience. It was always about knowing when to rise. Would you fight an HOA that tried to destroy you, or pay just to survive? If knowledge is power, why are residents discouraged from asking questions? And who should HOAs really serve, the community or the people controlling it?